Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to embark on a discussion of forest vegetation management. You know, just about everything that we do in the woods these days is controversial, and it's really important that we all have the facts at our fingertips when we're entering into discussions with our friends and colleagues about issues, so that emotion and misperceptions don't cloud debate on things like vegetation management and forest management. You might be wondering why the Canadian Forest Service, the federal government, is interested in this debate. The Canadian Forest Service is very concerned about the sustainable management of our forests right across the country, and for many years has participated in the research and the development of the many tools that we use in the woods, including those for vegetation management. And folks like Dave and myself have spent our entire careers researching the efficacy and the environmental integrity of many of the tools that we use, including the herbicide that we're going to talk about here today. So as Mike said, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of vegetation management, the tools that we use, and then Dave's going to focus particularly on the environmental side. I'm going to organize my talk in terms of many of the key questions that we've received from the public and try to answer some of those questions. They may be questions that you have yourselves or have heard from your constituents. The first deals with the fact that we're overplanting, we're simplifying our forests, we're taking our original Acadian forests and changing them to something different. And this pie chart shows our current forest inventory across the province. Roughly 50% of your forest consists of stands dominated by conifers or softwoods, or spruces, firs, pine, hemlock, cedar. About 33% of your forest consists of stands dominated by hardwoods, or poplars, birches, maples. And then about 20% exists as mixed woods. And it's very important to understand that each of these forest types is important. Each has its own unique ecological function, provides its own unique wildlife habitat, and certainly provides an economic resource for the sector. Quite often the discussion focuses on that softwood component because that is feeding the backbone of our very important sawmilling economy. But it's very important that we maintain this patchwork mosaic of different stand types and different forest types across the landscape through our forest management. Each of the stand types in this mosaic is part of our original Acadian forest, and the pies in this chart shifted from time to time and year to year and century to century, but it's important that these original parts of our Acadian forest be maintained. And of course, as one of our tools, we're going to talk about forest renewal here in a minute, as one of our tools, foresters tend to plant sites that will grow high quality, high value conifer and put those trees in the right spacing and the right stocking to grow good crops. And right now you're sitting at about 12% of your forest in the province as planted forest. You'll never realize more than about 18% across the province. That'll be about a maximum that you'll hit. And so we're not planting everywhere. We don't have monocultures everywhere. In fact, when you look at those specific plantations, they're actually quite diverse when you look within those stands. It's the landscape level diversity that's very important that our forest management needs to serve. Quite often, the public says, well, why not let nature take its course? Of course, natural disturbances such as fire, insects, disease, wind throw, all serve to regenerate that patchwork mosaic of different stand types on our land base. The large-scale disturbances like fire and insect tended to favor some of those conifer-dominated stands. The smaller-scale disturbances tended to favor more shade-tolerant species such as maple. So why not let nature run its course? Of course, in a province the size of ours, we can't afford to lose that resource to things like fire and insects. So we've become very good at protecting the forest from fire, protecting the forest from the spruce budworm, for example, and instead we rely more on man-made disturbances to regenerate the forest. And that's forest management. We use clear cutting on sites to try and emulate some of those large-scale disturbances like fire and insect. We'll use shelter wood cutting and selection cutting to emulate some of the smaller scale disturbances and regenerate shade-tolerant species. We rely on natural regeneration across the province on the vast majority of sites. Some 66% of our sites regenerate naturally. And we'll use artificial regeneration, planting and direct seeding, where we want to ensure stocking to the right species on the right sites. We'll follow regeneration with tending activities that we're going to talk about here in detail, and those tending activities are designed to ensure that the right type of forest is growing on the right site to serve that overall patchwork mosaic, and that's forest management. So what is vegetation management? Many of you have probably learned in your own backyard or your own woodlot that when you cut or you disturb a site, hardwoods tend to grow quite readily. They stump sprout, they sprout from root suckers, they regenerate from seed, and they grow very quickly. But if you're trying to grow spruce, for example, they grow much slower, and they can be quickly overtopped by grasses, broadleaf herbaceous vegetation, ferns, shrub vegetation, to the point where if we don't intervene, in nature's case, fire tended to suppress this vegetation, but if we don't intervene without fire, these seedlings can be quickly outcompeted for sunlight, soil moisture, nutrients, and space. And those are the key ingredients for life. And the act of suppressing temporarily the growth of some plants to allow other plants to dominate is vegetation management. And it's a concept that you're probably all familiar with if you've ever tried to grow carrots in your home garden. You know that if you don't get down on your hands and knees and pull some weeds, you don't have carrots at the end of the day. So we need to help these conifers out. This is a seedling in one of my studies in northwestern New Brunswick, just 3 growing seasons after planting, and that's a person standing in there, and you can appreciate that that seedling isn't getting a lot of the key ingredients for life there. So vegetation is very important in the early stages of life to maintain conifer on the landscape. Now, I've had plenty of folks say, well, I know that if you just leave them, they'll eventually survive. And in some very rare cases, that's true. We're standing now in an 18-year-old spruce plantation. It was a spruce-dominated forest that was clear-cut harvested about 20 years ago. And this these trees, and you can see the planted rows, are eking out a meager existence beneath what is now a low-quality, off-site hardwood stand, because this is a conifer-dominant site. Somebody spent close to $1,000 a hectare planting those trees. Somebody intended those spruce to regenerate conifer within that overall patchwork mosaic on the landscape, and a lack of vegetation management resulted in the loss of that investment and those objectives not being achieved. Now, the interesting part about this slide is right across the road is a part of the same plantation that was tended, and the difference is night and day. So vegetation management is key to maintaining conifer on our landscape. So how do we go about doing vegetation management? Across Canada, and certainly here in New Brunswick, we rely heavily on 2 main tools: manual cutting and the use of herbicides. And I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each, because it's important to understand that each of these tools has its own niche in our toolkit. Manual cutting is done in New Brunswick on about 15 to 20,000 hectares a year. And it works very well when we're dealing with competition that exists between saplings of different tree stems. And we can select stems to promote wildlife habitat and timber production objectives. We can select those trees that are disease-free and improve the health of the stand by doing this. We can use it in sensitive areas because it's boots on the ground. We can use it near water. We can use it near human habitation. And generally, this methodology is socially acceptable, but we have to appreciate that it is very expensive, about $600 to $4,000 per hectare. It's labor intensive. We're probably tapping out the labor supply in the province right now doing those 15 to 20,000 hectares. And as you probably have learned in your own garden, when you cut grasses, herbaceous vegetation, and shrubs, they quickly resprout, causing you to spend those dollars all over again, which would be a very negative thing. Something that we tend not to talk about, this technique uses about 2 to 3 liters of gasoline per hectare with 2-cycle mix oil and produces known carcinogens, actually many of them, that we're exposing our workforce to when they use this technique. So our foresters here in New Brunswick have become very good at identifying the right places to use this tool where it is effective. Where we're dealing with competition from grasses, ferns, herbaceous vegetation, shrub vegetation, and the objective is conifer dominance in that patchwork mosaic, a herbicide provides us with a much more efficient and effective tool. Allows us a very selective tool to temporarily suppress that competing vegetation and allow our conifers to dominate. It's absolutely an essential tool for maintaining conifer on the landscape, so that landscape level diversity, and it's an essential tool for maintaining the affordable supply of conifer to our softwood mills at an order of magnitude less cost than manual cutting, about $150 to $200 per hectare. It's certainly very important for maintaining timely and cost-effective regeneration. One of the important things that I just really realized is a real misperception amongst the public is that we don't spray a given stand every year like we might an agricultural crop. Any given stand receives 1 and occasionally 2 treatments within that 2 to 4 year old period in a 40 to 60 year rotation. So we'll treat in the first 2 to 4 years, and then that stand never sees herbicide until it's harvested and it's in its regeneration cycle again. And that's an important point to keep in mind, and it's one that Dave's going to talk about when he talks about risk. Of course, the cons of this, it does take a higher degree of sophistication. You need a higher level of training to apply herbicides. You need more sophisticated equipment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the reason that we're all having this morning discussion, it's controversial. The key point to remember, and I mentioned this earlier, that manual cutting and herbicides each occupy a niche in our toolbox. We can't use one tool to replace the other. They each do their own job on certain sites, so we need the right mix of these 2 tools to do the job. Why aerial application? A lot of people tend to think that aerial application is potentially dangerous and risky affair, and virtually all of our forestry herbicides across the country, including right here in New Brunswick, are applied by air. And the reason is that it is indeed the safest way to apply herbicides. Today's applications are done by very highly trained, licensed individuals using state-of-the-art application equipment with GPS guidance and navigation. The GPS systems actually control the spray booms so that the spray booms cannot be turned on if the applicator is not over the area that's to be treated. And the systems record exactly what was sprayed, how much, and where in a GIS mapping spatial environment. And all those files are kept on record, so if somebody wants to come back a day later, a week later, a year later and say, I don't believe that fella treated in the right spot, we can show them exactly where that herbicide was applied. Each of our spray blocks are designed with buffer zones to protect sensitive areas and are pre-approved by the Ministry of the Environment. So we're not deciding on the fly willy-nilly that we're going to spray in a certain area. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. We're using low drift systems now. In contrast to what we used even 10 years ago, we're using large droplet systems that virtually come straight down out of the helicopter, intended to put the herbicide where we want it. And when you look at aerial application relative to ground application, it is the lowest carbon footprint, the lowest environmental footprint when you consider that some of our ground application involves soil compaction and potential for erosion and things like that. So aerial application is really important to us. So what specific herbicide are we using in forestry? We've got across Canada 5 active ingredients that are registered for forestry use, but we rely almost exclusively on one, and that is glyphosate-based products, and that's across Canada, not just here in New Brunswick. And the reason for that is that our conifer trees, our spruces and pines, form a waxy cuticle over their needles at this time of the year, right towards the end of the summer, to protect them from the harsh winter, but it also protects them from absorbing this herbicide, whereas the target vegetation is very susceptible to it. So this provides us with a highly selective tool. Of course, this herbicide has a very favorable environmental profile and relatively low toxicity to humans and wildlife, and Dave's going to dwell on those advantages explicitly in the next few minutes here. The other big reason that we rely on glyphosate is it is a very, very important tool in agriculture. We have more than 40 years of safe use with this herbicide in agriculture, not only here in Canada but around the world, and 30 years of safe use with it in forestry. It's registered in over 150 countries on over 100 different food crops. And here in Canada, we apply it to wheat, corn, soybeans, and crops like that. It's a key tool in maintaining world's food supply. A key tool, absolutely essential, and over 100 million kilograms of this herbicide are used annually around the world. Most of the glyphosate that we spray in Canada goes on to Saskatchewan wheat fields at the end of the growing season to dry that wheat. And our forestry use, ironically, only represents 4% of the total use of this herbicide in Canada. So it's very, very important. And behind 40 years of safe use worldwide, we've got probably the largest body of science backing up the safe use of this herbicide. So a lot of experience. But isn't glyphosate bad? In March 2015, a subcommittee of the World Health Organization called the International Agency for Research on Cancer abruptly, and I say that because there was no new findings, no new data to make the decision, but very abruptly decided to categorize glyphosate in class 2A, which contains probable human carcinogens. And that really rocked all of us who have been using this herbicide for 40 years. It rocked the public, who gets very confused about, well, geez, this is another Agent Orange. You know, it's very disturbing when something like this happens. And you really need to understand the context. And I've sort of summarized the context of this decision twofold here. The International Agency for Research on Cancer ranks agents or substances based on their potential to cause harm under some circumstances. So they rank substances based on their hazard, whereas our regulators look at risk, the probability of causing harm under real-world exposure levels. And Dave's going to talk about risk explicitly, so I don't want to delve into that, but perhaps it'll allow you to understand, if you look at some of the teammates of glyphosate in category 2A, red meat, for example, hot beverages, shift work, hairdressing, are all in that same category of being probable human carcinogens. And if you look at category 2B, which is known human carcinogens, we use gasoline every day. It's in category 2B. Processed meat, bacon. Did you have bacon this morning? It is a known human carcinogen. So do we ban these things? No, but knowing that they could cause harm informs our regulators in terms of formulating regulations around mitigating risk, and that's what Dave is going to talk about. The second point that you need to consider is that IARC, this subcommittee, looks at a very narrow view of the data. They only look at published literature, whereas our regulators look at all available data. So proprietary data, supplementary data to the published literature, unpublished literature, and so on. So in many ways, they have a much broader view. And I think where you can take comfort is the fact that the World Health Organization, the body, in fact, ironically, that IARC reports to, our U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency, the European Food Safety Authority, the Australians, the list goes on and on. All of our knowledgeable regulators around the world since March 2015 revisited their position on glyphosate, looked at any new data, and said, are we making the right choice? And unanimously, these bodies reaffirm that glyphosate, when used according to label instructions, does not pose a cancer or any other risk. And I think that's where we really need to draw comfort from in this argument. I want to put a plug in for Forest Info. Mike talked about it earlier. It is a website that is easily accessed from anywhere you have Wi-Fi. It's question and answer based. It has us answering questions that the public have posed in short form, in long form, and providing all the scientific backing to the answers to those questions. There's little video vignettes. There's Dr. Ritter, who apologizes for not being able to be here today to speak to the human health aspect. He loves doing that, and he wanted me to flash his email here, and he welcomes any questions that you folks might have about specific human health issues if they're not answered on this website. There is room on this website to pose your own question, and we'll endeavor to answer it as quickly as possible. It's a wonderful resource. It's maintained, it's kept active, and all of the spray programs for our New Brunswick and Nova Scotia are posted on this, so you can look at specifically where plans are to treat. It's a very good resource that was put together by the federal and provincial governments in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, forest industry, and some NGOs. A really great effort. Please use this website. Please share it with your constituents who have concerns. Forestinfo.ca. I just want to take a minute and step away from herbicides now, because we often get the question, well, don't you have any other tools after all these years? And in fact, we spent millions of dollars, $15 million through the 1990s, researching alternatives to the use of herbicides. It was a huge program, coast to coast. Much of the research was done right here in New Brunswick. We looked at planting large trees to try and get a head start on the competition. We looked at harnessing nature's vegetation management control tool, fire, and using that in a prescribed fashion. We looked at mulches to try and suppress the regeneration of undesired vegetation. We looked at using critters to eat the undesired vegetation. We even went to the lengths of registering a biological herbicide, a naturally occurring fungus, Condysterium purpureum, that can be applied directly to the cut stumps to prevent the resprouting. Each of these tools works some places, sometime. They provide nowhere near the consistency of a herbicide. They each have their own environmental risks, their own human health risks, their own wildlife risks, and they each have their own very, very high costs, unfortunately. And that really prohibits their operational use. They're really only used in very specific situations. So the bottom line, if people says, oh, we need to start a research program up to look at these things, we've been there, we've done that, we know a lot about these different tools, and that's already been done. So just to summarize here a point that Robert made, here in New Brunswick you harvest about 60,000 hectares, give or take, each year, and that represents 1% of your land mass, about 1.7% of your forest production land base. You rely on natural regeneration, areas that really won't see any herbicide, on 2/3 of that land base. You aim to put conifer on the right sites with the right stocking on about a third of that area, and you use herbicides on roughly the same amount of area that you plant. Sometimes herbicides are used in natural regeneration, but not very often. You use manual cutting on another third to produce conifer-dominant stands, mixed woods, and hardwood-dominant stands, and you rely on hardwood regeneration on high-quality, high-value hardwood sites to produce quality hardwood. And it's through this mix of silviculture that your foresters here in New Brunswick serve that overall patchwork mosaic of different stand types and different age classes that I told you about. And through that endeavor, provide unique wildlife habitat that provides for spiritual, recreational value, protecting our freshwater resources that we're so well known for here in Canada, all while supporting an economically viable forest sector. And you can't underestimate the value of that sector to the economy. You folks know better than anyone that every single community is dependent on that forest sector for their livelihood. You probably don't know that your average managed hectare here in New Brunswick is 3 times as more productive, grows 3 times the wood that Quebec's does, 5 times the wood that my home province, Ontario's, does, when we're looking specifically at their land production land base. And that's something to be proud of. It's your forest management, which I believe is world-class here in New Brunswick, that provides that productivity. And in brackets behind each one of those statistics is your relativity to the rest of Canada when we look at the productive hectares in Canada. So you are contributing to the economy through your forest sector, and you're doing it big time, and I think that's something to be proud of.